Welcome, everybody. We always like this. We call it in-house, we call it Stump the Chump. So we're always happy to have people ask us questions. And if we don't know the answer and don't feel like we can give you a good answer, we will invite you to share with Chris your email address, and we'll get back to you with it because we don't like to leave people hanging. And if we don't know it, we should probably look it up. I asked everybody who's talking to bring a couple things up just that were interesting them in the garden right now. I've got a couple. The first is this magnolia, and I see Tim's got more magnolias. This is a little magnolia called Magnolia amabilis. We received it as Magnolia angusti oblonga and couldn't find a whole lot of information about that, but didn't quite match up when we got closer to looking at it. So this Magnolia amabilis, you could probably consider it a first cousin to Magnolia laevifolia, which is a more common evergreen magnolia. This one makes a small shrub. Some of the differences are it's got these very narrow leaves, and the sepals, petals on the magnolia flowers are much more pointed than you would get in folia. Otherwise, very similar. It's got kind of the coppery, fuzzy buds on there. And some taxonomists would probably lump this in with Magnolia laevifolia, but we do think it is different enough to warrant its own name. Grows in sun to part shade, has a nice, even to me, with a terrible sense of smell, lemony scent like our own native magnolias. It's been pretty reliable for us, but probably will take damage if it goes down. If we get a real cold zone 7 winter, I imagine it would take some damage. We got this from Akira Shibamichi in Japan, as I said, as Angusti oblonga, but there are some differences that only a botanist could love. So we won't go far with that. But I mentioned that because this is another plant that we got not directly from Akira Shibamichi in Japan, but through a friend of ours who got it from him. This is one of the Chinese redbuds, Cercis chinensis, and this is a form called just Shibamichi red. It's not really red, but there are no redbuds that are really red, but it has a much more clear pink flower than the more lavender flowers that you get in other redbuds. When you put it next to other redbuds, it's really very different, but it's as red as our native form called Crosswicks red or Tennessee red, which is to say a nice clear pink. Makes a multi-stem shrub smaller than our native. Beautiful, beautiful plants. They bloom just prolifically. Really nice forms. All right, I'm going to pass this on to Tim to talk about a few plants he brought.
I brought a collection of yellow magnolias. The key thing with them is they have one of the parents being Magnolia acuminata, which is one of our native species of magnolias here in the eastern United States. And I grew up with that growing behind my house back home in Pennsylvania. They tend to flower later than the traditional pinks and whites that you get of the mostly Solangianas and Stellata hybrids. So they miss a lot of the frost, which is a key thing. And there's a selection of them here, a little bit of different parentage on here. These first three over here are what would be considered Magnolia brooklyndensis. They were some hybrids originally made at the Brooklyn Botanic Garden. The first one here is Yellow Fever, then Elizabeth, which was the first it's not promiscuous or precocious flowering yellow magnolia available. It flowers before it leaves out, basically. And then the next one is Lois, which is a back cross of a sister seedling of Elizabeth with another acuminata. So it has a little bit smaller flower, but a little bit more intense yellow in it than the Elizabeth. All three of these, though, have Magnolia denuedata as their other main parent aside from acuminata. The next one here is Magnolia Yellow Lantern, which it's Magnolia acuminata variety subcordata crossed with Magnolia Solangiana Alexandria, which Solangiana, I believe, they're denuedata crossed with Lilia flora. Mm-hmm. So it still has that denuedata blood in it, and it has a very similar flower, with a hint of pink in it, though, probably because of the Alexandria. I think it's a pretty deep colored one, if I remember right. The final one here is a Magnolia Judy Zook, which she's a little bit different. She's out of the breeding program at Brooklyn Botanic Garden, but it does not include Denuedata in its bloodline. It's a complex hybrid, which includes Cuminata, Liliiflora, and Stellata instead of Denuedata. So that's that collection there. So some really cool magnolias for later in the season, like I said, and typically miss late frost. My favorite, though, is Lois, which is just this soft yellow. The other group here I have are some Tulipa clusiana selections. Tulipa clusiana is one of the most reliable ones for long-term here in the Southeast, provided you don't have voles or squirrels. They'll take out any tulip, but your typical large flowered hybrid tulips don't last long here in the Raleigh area in particular. You plant them, you might get them for 2 to 3 years, and then they fizzle away if you're lucky. They'll have lasted that long. These can last decades. They flower early. They typically are going to have, the outer sepals are going to have red on them, and the inner sepals are either going to be a shade of yellow or white. There's some different ones in here, which just subtle differences. I have to think now. This is Lady Jane, which is a white with red on the outside. This is a very similar one. Darn, and it's, pardon? Yes, peppermint stick. Thank you. And then this is Chrysantha, Clusiana variety Chrysantha, which is a small red on the outside, yellow, intense yellow on the inside, and a select form of that called Tubergen gem. And then there's one that's kind of an intermediate. It's a paler yellow, and that is Cynthia. But all of these have done really well for us here in the garden. Like I said, as long as the squirrels don't find them. Otherwise, they get moved about or just become dinner. So.
2 plants I brought to talk about today. The first one is flowering quince in the genus Chinomales, or Chinomales, some people say. And I just wanted to show the breadth of color that the flowers come in. Here at the Arboretum, they are past their peak, most of them now, and on their way down. I could hardly find a flower on our white one, Jet Trail. There are pure white. Then there are pale colors. This is Pink Storm, and it's not even quite open yet, and it's a medium pink. There's lots of shades of red. This is Charlotte Red, or Red Charlotte. This one is one that stops everybody in their tracks. It's over by the Oak Grove. This is called Dragon's Blood, and it's in full flower right now. And it's a very nice dark red. And then one up on the Weeping Walk that stops everybody in their tracks when they get here is Tsuya Hamada, which is a dark blood red. So if that's your thing, last week when it was in full bloom, it was absolutely beautiful. Everyone who came to the Arboretum was stopping and asking about it. It's a really cool plant. Then there's my personal favorite, which is called Orange Storm. The Orange Storm and Pink Storm were bred by North Carolina State University's breeder, Tom Rainey. And Orange Storm's got these very large double orange flowers. And in my garden, I don't have any reds around it. It actually looks more red in my garden. It would be a good red flower if you didn't have a red flower nearby. I picked it because I really like Chinomales a lot. And it's a good, like a hedge shrub. Some of them have thorns on them, although the Storm series does not have thorns on it. I consider that an improvement, but I know some people don't. If you want it as a hedge to keep your neighbors out, you want one with the thorns on it. Now that it's going out of flower, within the next 4 weeks or so, would be a good time to prune them, okay? They bloom on old wood, so you don't want to prune them too late in the year. And you can prune them now to shape them. If you prune them, you will get more branches that will have more flowers next year. Some of these might produce a little fruit on it. If you really want the fruit, you don't want to prune them now, but you'll be pruning away the fruits. But the ones I've grown, I've never really seen much in the way of fruit. I don't know if you guys are seeing any fruit here.
If they have fruit on them here, we tend to get rust on them, and they aren't pretty to look at.
Yeah. All right, and the other plant I brought, which is way out of flower by now, are hellebores. And the reason I wanted to talk about them is it's also a pruning thing. It's getting time to think about deadheading your hellebores. Here, this spent flower has swelling ovaries, and those ovaries are filled with dozens and dozens of seeds. And if you don't do anything about them, these will turn tan and then brown, and then they'll split open and spill seeds everywhere. And you'll have hundreds and hundreds of hellebore seedlings coming up around your parent plant. So it's time to get in and pinch off the old blooms now, or you still have a few weeks to wait before these turn brown and start releasing their seed. But once they become pollinated, they do kind of lose their color. You can see here's the original color, a nice purple. And so they are not as pretty as they once were. All right, so those are the plants that I had to share.
Dennis, and that's a good reason for getting some of the newer hybrids, which are sterile, and then you don't have to worry about your hellebores forming seed. And I know new gardeners, and this is a ask the, stump the chump kind of thing. So we may have a lot of new gardeners on it. A lot of new gardeners say, oh, I love the idea of my hellebores seeding around and spreading and getting more that way because hellebores are expensive. But you often get muddy colors and they can become quite a thicket after a while.
They do. I do let mine seed around in my own yard a little bit. I will, just a few weeks ago, I went and rogued out all the ugly colored ones and left the pretty colored ones in place. But I don't do that all the time. Most of the time I take the flowers off because I already have enough hellebores. After just a few years of seeds, I have more hellebores than I know what to do with.
Yeah. I don't know what a wild berry vine is specifically, but getting rid of vines is often tough, just in general. A lot of weedy vines that you don't want. So it kind of depends on what you're looking at. If these are woody vines that are growing up into trees, cut them off down at the base, and you can paint them with a little bit of a weed killer. Broadleaf weed killer or a general spectrum one is good. If they're more things that are scrambling all over the ground, kind of like a ground cover, if you can go in and kind of mow over them and then spray that with a weed killer. Otherwise, it's pulling and digging. You got some other thought, Tim?
My guess is it's a rubus, a blackberry is probably what you're talking about, berry vines. But that is a challenge to get rid of rubus or blackberries, raspberries. The brambles in general can be rather persistent, and it will take repeated sprayings to get rid of that, or digging persistently.
Yeah. If we are talking about wild brambles like raspberries and things, if you go and get yourself a pair of good, thick leather gloves, we're talking about like welding gloves, blackberries actually come out of the ground pretty easily. So you can pull out the bulk of them. They will come back because little bits of root, they will come back. But when they start coming back, if you spray them pretty regularly, you can do a pretty good job of them. It's just that first time to get them pulled out, you got to have, you got to be wearing something that you can, fight sharks with.
I have a pulmonaria in my yard. It's never.
Repeat the question.
Okay. Do you deadhead a pulmonaria after it flowers, and when do you divide it? I've never deadheaded mine. They just kind of go away in my yard. And dividing, it'd probably be best in the fall to give it time to root in.
Back home in Pennsylvania, I had Pulmonaria mollis, which is a species. I've not gotten it to grow down here, but it would sell so prolifically. But it's not it wasn't a select cultivar. If you're going for one that's a select cultivar and you're worried about them not coming true, you could deadhead them. But I have mollis actually coming up as somewhat of a carpet, and it gets big. You tell the foliage on it. Down here, it dies. But if you don't want to have, like the hellebores, the wrong colors, you might deadhead them. But it wouldn't be a big deal if you did.
Yeah, I'd say for the people joining us in Michigan, perhaps to keep from seed, but here in the South, it's not a problem. For the ones that do grow well around here, I've never had issues with them seeding. So I'm like Dennis. I never deadhead them. You can if you have 26, 28, 32 hours in your day. I don't have them in mine, so I don't deadhead it. And yeah, I'm one of those people that I garden when I can. So in terms of dividing, if I'm going to divide it in the fall, I wait till after it flowers because it's early, and you can divide it right after it flowers and give it some time to get set. But they really like it a little bit cooler. So dividing in the fall, they will put on a lot of root growth, like Dennis said, and you'll get a much better reestablishment if you divide them later. The question is, what would cause an Okami cherry to only flower on the bottom half? And it's now fully in leaf. And we all looked at each other, kind of stumped. Chris had the idea that Okami cherries are grafted almost always. And so if something from below the graft union was growing up, and Okami is a relatively compact plant, so if the rootstock were growing and you had Okami and rootstock growing, the rootstock could get taller and might not flower, whereas Okami flowered underneath it. It looks like just the bottom half or the lower limbs around it with the other part growing above it. Other than that, I can't really think of a reason why it would do that. It's not going to be cold that's blasting the top flowers, especially not a year like this. If they're local, yeah, I don't know. I'd look really carefully at the bark and the leaves and the buds of the parts that flowered and the parts that didn't, and see if you see a difference in those. So the question was, somebody has raspberries that are invading their other parts of their garden and they want to move them. The question is, should they cut them back? So most brambles, there are some new ones that are different than this. Most brambles fruit on their second year's growth. So the new growth that comes up this year won't flower and fruit. But next year, you'll get flowers and fruit on those stems. So in general, if you're growing brambles, once a stem has flowered and fruited, cut it back because you want the new growth coming up. You know, you want to keep that new growth coming. So you're cutting out all the stems that have fruited every year, and that'll keep it open and get you the most fruit every year. So if you're moving it, if you haven't done that this winter, you can cut out any of the stuff that is old enough to have fruited last year. If it's the first year growth or even that second year growth that's going to flower and fruit this year, you might want to keep that on the plant and move it. You know, certainly it will be easier for the plant if you cut the stems back and move it that way. But as you said, it's moving around and invading your other plants. So, you know, they're pretty easy to move. There are some new forms that flower and fruit on the first year's growth. And so once you get them established, you can cut them to the ground every year and you're not in there trying to pick and choose which branches to cut. And so just for ease of maintenance and not thinking about it, I like those. So if you're buying new ones, look for some of those that flower and fruit on first year's growth. Oh, sure. This red bud is Cercis chinensis, which was one of the more shrubby Chinese forms, and it's called Shibamichi Red. Shibamichi is the name of a nurseryman in Japan, kind of one of the older established nurseries. He's very well known. The nursery's been in his family for many years. He's a big friend of the Arboretum, loves the JCRA Arboretum. But you may know him if you've grown sky pencil holly, the Japanese holly that's very narrow and upright. That's one that came from Akira Shibamichi.
I've been transplanting mine the last few weeks. That's probably not the best time. They're tough. You can transplant them anytime. I don't know if there's a best time.
Want to say what them is since you didn't repeat the question?
Yes. When's the best time to transplant hellebores? When it's cool, I guess would be the best time. Not in the middle of summer. Yeah. I've transplanted mine, some in the fall. I've done them in, a few weeks ago, late winter. So they all seem to do fine in that time frame.
The ideal time might be, you can, anytime you have time to do it, of course. But I think,
Dick Tyler.
Dick, he did a talk for the Rock Garden Society. I think it was last fall, or no, this spring or winter, January. And he said probably the ideal time would be fall, just as they're coming into growth. If I remember correctly, but I could be wrong, so that they have time to establish through the winter months.
If that video is online.
Yeah.
There you go. In case you missed that last part from Chris, the video that Tim was talking about, the Dick Tyler's discussion about hellebores, and which includes when to move them, is online on the J.C. Ralston Arboretum's YouTube page. So you can go there and see that if you'd like. There are a couple of tricky hellebores as well. The Helleborus niger, which does not grow very well for us anyway, that can be tricky to transplant. But otherwise, I transplant in the middle of summer, in the middle of winter, which isn't ideal, but it's when I have time and things seem to do fine.
Yeah, without knowing which species, it's a little bit challenging. If it were like Metabolus, oh yes, I'm sorry. I'm cutting back an 8-foot tall hibiscus woody species, which there's a lot of different ones. If it were Mutabolus, which I would cut it back, which is one of the subtropical ones, which tends to get a lot of damage for us here anyways. It just kind of evens it out. It won't flower until super late in the season anyways. That would be one to definitely cut back. If it's a Syriacus, that is the Rose of Sharon, it's up to you. You can be hard on them and you can cut them back fairly hard and they'll flower fine and dandy in the same summer, or you forget about them and don't do anything, they'll be fine too. It just depends a lot on the species. I don't know. What do you have to add?
Yeah, so without knowing exactly which one, because there are a lot, it can be a little bit difficult. But I'll tell you this, if the flower is 2 to 3 inches, maybe even 4 inches, you probably have Hibiscus syriacus. And that is a woody plant. It is grown as a multi-stemmed small tree usually, but you can cut it back hard and let it grow let it flush back out. And unless you cut it back really hard, like to the ground, it'll probably flower for you. They're very tough. The other ones, if your flowers are 4, 5, 6, 8, 10 inches, then it's likely one of the Mutabolus types, or there's a bunch of those. And those tend to grow many more stems, tend to be thinner stems, and you can cut those back to the ground, almost all of them, and they'll grow up and be fine and flower for you this year. And if somebody's joining us from South Florida and it's a tropical hibiscus, you can cut on that whenever you want and it'll be just fine. Covered them all.
That might be just a recent, like the new growth hasn't had time to form buds yet. The ones here are flowering halfway or more up the stem. So that just might be the new, you got a whole lot of new growth at the top and it hasn't had time to form buds yet.
Yeah, and so the question was, why did some of these quince just flower towards the bottom? And as Dennis said, the flowers on a quince, that's not a great example. Yeah. You can hold it up because We're looking at all. The flowers on a quince, as Dennis said, they flower on old growth. So that is where the flower buds was all from last year. That was new growth last year. And then, we've got some new growth above that where there aren't flowers yet. So that was off of last year. So if you have never pruned your quince, the growth gets smaller and smaller as the plants get bigger. Otherwise, all these plants would get humongous. So the best thing to do is trim your quince back right after it finishes flowering to encourage more new growth this year. And that way you'll get those buds that form over the summer, and then there'll be more growth beyond that towards the tip. But if you do that regularly, you'll get more flower buds. And I think Dennis alluded to that at the beginning, but sometimes that where and when the flower buds form sometimes confuses people. But anything that flowers early in the spring, those buds are formed in the previous year. So in terms of pruning, prune them within, as Dennis said, 4 weeks of them finishing flowering. And that gives time for new growth to form, new buds to form, and flower the next year. So azaleas, forsythia, any of those types of plants. Thorns don't keep deer away from plants. I hate to say it, they really don't. But thorny plants are often good nesting plants for birds.
And they'll keep the neighbor kids away. Yes. Okay. So cultivar name, probably got a weird cultivar name. It's one of those ones with a marketing name and a cultivar name. It's in the Double Take series because it's double flowered. And this one is Orange Storm. A lot of the ones that Tom Rainey did have Storm in the name, and they're in the Double Take series. This is Pink Storm. There's a Scarlet Storm. There's several in the Storm series, and they're in the Double Take series.
So typically when we talk about brambles, we're talking about rubus, blackberry, and raspberry, thorny stems that kind of make suckering, shrubby kind of plants that spread. Honeysuckle is a true vine that will grow and have tubular flowers. Our native ones are orange, red. The invasive A Japanese honeysuckle vine is white and yellow flowers. They age yellow. And then there are a lot of other vines that are out there, that grow. There's Smilex, which is a vine that grows, a native vine, but it's thorny. There's a lot of vines out there like that. So what age or size can they expect their southern Magnolia grandiflora to flower? And nobody wants to go on record with an answer because it really depends on the cultivar. So if you got a seedling, dug it out of the woods, or it was on your property, or somebody gave you one, it might take it, 6, 8, 10 years after you put in your landscape to flower, and it might never flower very well. Most of the named cultivars are named because they are superior plants, and that they're often named because they flower younger, they flower heavier, they may have more petals. It may be that the plant is a good shape, but generally, even in that case, it will flower. So if you get a good named one like Brackensbaum Beauty or Haas, or there's a whole bunch of. I would think that if you were to buy, say, a 3-foot, 3-gallon plant, that it should flower within 2 years at the most after you put it in the ground.
Using catnip as a deterrent, I haven't heard that as an offhand thing, but it wouldn't surprise me. It's used to bring in a lot of pollinators, and maybe it also brings in some other beneficials that might help to combat those other things. I can't say for certain whether it would work on cabbage butterflies or not, but I could see them come to pollinate it. It might draw them in. So I don't know. Have you heard anything, Mark?
So yeah, the question was about catnip or catmint repelling, like cabbage loopers and things like that. I'm not like Tim. I haven't heard that specifically, but we often grow herbs, in rose gardens and around vegetable gardens, because those heavily scented herbs with a lot of scent in the foliage often do deter other things. I don't know about that one in particular. Certainly wouldn't hurt.
Magnolias. Oh, what plants should we be concerned about with the upcoming freeze tomorrow night, and Friday night? Magnolias, for sure, right?
It depends how cold it gets. If the upper 20s might not bother the magnolias too much, but if you get mid 20s and lower, it could affect the magnolias, for instance. But it would be more of any early planted things. If you've been out shopping and you've planted your tomatoes already, you might want to cover them or bring them in. Your peppers, those are truly tender. A lot of the stuff that's out currently, if it should be okay. If it's trees and shrubs, they're probably pretty well adapted, I think. I don't know.
What about camellias or loropetalum?
Camellias,
if they're already open.
If you get down below 28, the camellia blossoms will get some damage, typically.
And so 2 things going on here. When Dennis is talking about magnolias and camellias and things, he's talking about damage to flowers. Yeah. So should you be concerned about damage to flowers that are open? On trees and shrubs where they're up above the ground, especially large things with larger petals like the magnolias or Tim's magnolias versus something like a red bud, yes. Should you be concerned about the plant? No. The trees and shrubs that you might have concern with are things that are just opening the foliage. 2007, we had an Easter freeze, but it was much lower, much colder, and things with new growth really got zapped and it ultimately killed things that are perfectly hardy. It doesn't look like here in central North Carolina, it's going to get that cold. I usually look at, you start getting to below 19 degrees is where real tissue damage on hardy things that are leafing out starts to happen. Things that are like herbaceous things that are in the ground, hardy plants that are in the ground are probably going to be mostly fine. You may get some burnt leaves on there, but they've got all the warmth from the ground to kind of insulate them, so to help them. So freshly planted things, that stuff's coming out of a greenhouse. Yeah, you might be in trouble with that. But even freshly planted perennials, if they haven't been just pushed too hard in a nursery, they're probably going to be fine. But you may see a lot of ugly plants. You may see a lot of Japanese maples with new leaves. If it gets cold enough, they're going to get burnt. And, a lot of times that ugliness can last the season. But unless it gets much colder than it's calling for, it's not going to actually damage the health of the plant, but the looks for sure. So the question was, somebody has a 12-year-old azalea that had green leaves all winter, all of a sudden has turned brown and died. Other azaleas, I'm assuming in the same area, but at least the same age and the same type, look fine. If they're not in the same area, well, let me go back and I'll toss it to somebody else because this is a question where there could be multiple answers. It's almost certainly a root problem. I think we can probably all agree with that. So it's been a very wet year this past year. So if that is in a slightly lower spot, the soil is a little bit heavier, anything like that, and more moisture is sitting there around the roots, that could kill that plant, while one right next to it that maybe the water doesn't sink in right there at the roots, that could be fine. The other issue that Tim kind of mentioned, first thing that popped to his mind was something eating on the roots like voles.
Or girdling it.
Or girdling it, so if you have things chewing on the bark, you have things chewing on the roots, that can be a problem. And if that's the case, and they're all in the same area, look for another one to start going downhill soon, because once they killed the one, they're not going to like to eat anymore. They're going to want to go on to the next one. Y'all have any other thoughts?
That's exactly
Yeah,
what
I first went to roots, some root problem. So the question is, somebody in East Tennessee with alkaline soil wants to know about planting Pieris japonica. Well, build a raised bed and put a lot of peat moss, mix a lot of peat moss in. That would be one way to go. You want to acidify the soil for that ericaceous stuff.
It's a hard one.
Okay, so it's interesting, alkaline soil and ericaceous things. Ericaceous plants like acidic soils. If you see them in the wild, they're growing on limestone mountains. That is where they grow. If you go up in the mountains in East Tennessee and see the azaleas and the rhododendron, they're growing in lime-based soils. Now, they're being acidified by the compost that's going there. And you see the same things in Asia. They're growing on limestone mountains where you see Pieris. So I have seen wonderful ericaceous collections, plants in the heath family, like Pieris and azalea and rhododendron and blueberries. I have seen them growing very well in alkaline soils. Doing a raised bed is great. I'm not a big peat proponent, just because if it dries out, it becomes very difficult to re-wet. So unless it's being irrigated, I tend to stay away from that. But most organic composts are acidic. You can get acidic things that are acidic fertilizers like hollytone or mur acid. The question said that the current thinking is not to amend when you plant, and that's don't amend a hole when you plant. If you make a raised bed and you use an amended soil that's alkaline there, and it doesn't have to be, a raised bed does not have to be, a rectangle with 12-inch high boards that you fill up like a vegetable garden. It can be a berm where you bring in soil and organic matter and make a berm and have something very natural. You can put boulders in there. It can look just like the rest of East Tennessee, but with a composted soil. If you don't want to do that, I would say plant it. If it's a new bed, till up the bed, till in some organic matter into the bed to add some acidity and add some of the nutrients that are less available in alkaline soils, because it's usually about availability of nutrients. Do that. Or if it's an established bed, plant your Pieris, plant it high, and then do a compost and a more acidic compost top dressing on there and fertilize with hollytone or mur acid. And the second part of the question was about a specific cultivar, Pieris Little Heath Green. Does it really stay 3 to 4 feet tall, 3 feet tall by 3 to 4 feet wide? And the answer is, what's your time frame? A 10-year-old Little Heath Pieris, 3 feet tall and wide is probably about right. It's definitely a very dwarf one. A 20-year-old one is going to be bigger. A real small one called Pygmea with super fine leaves, looks like a conifer. I've seen those, almost 12 feet tall, but they were very, very, very old plants. So they keep growing, but they do it slowly. I'll repeat the question and then see if we get somebody else to answer, because I feel like I'm talking too much. So this is a question about having bulbs flower in shady spots, part shade spots. And these are specifically shady spots that are shady year round. So they are under evergreen trees or being shaded by structures, which is a lot different from deciduous trees, because early bulbs put up leaves early, so that they can get some sunlight under deciduous trees. So bulbs specifically.
All my experiences with part sun, deciduous shade.
Not the normal ones, but cyclamen and coon may be worth trying. Take the dry shade. They tend to be rather shade tolerant, though they'll take sun too. That's one. I don't know if leucojum might be worth a try. It's pretty versatile on at least deciduous shade, but depending on how dense the shade is from the structures and evergreens, it may be worth a try. Maybe some of the trout lilies. I don't know.
Yeah, that's a real tough one. And I guess I would respond with why bulbs in particular. Are you asking about bulbs because you want early flowering bulbs, which tend to flower, early, and you want flowers at that time? Because you can look into some, perennials that flower at that time or flower later. If you just want bulbs because you're having trouble finding bulbs to grow in that dense of shade, that type of shade, then I think it might just be time to move on to something else. If you're having the amount of trouble that you're talking about with that kind of shade. The question was, why do organic gardeners who use large amounts, who mulch a lot, use a lot of compost and mulch, why do they wind up with soil tests with a lot of phosphorus and potassium?
What's in the compost? Yeah, it's like, source material. Whatever's you're using in that compost is probably what's adding to that. If you're not adding any typical chemical fertilizers that you would, that would be my guess. I know it depends on what it is.
Yeah, as compost degrades, any phosphorus in the cells are going to be released in a free form, not in a form that's bound to rock. It's going to be just in the rotting plant material.
Yeah, that's not an issue that I've ever really run into as a problem. Phosphorus and potassium are relatively stable in the soil. They don't leach out. So you may have more phosphorus and potassium than nitrogen in comparison to somebody who's using regularly some other type of fertilizer that has nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus in it, because they are adding a lot of nitrogen regularly with that, and that's leaching, so when you do a test, you're still catching some of that nitrogen and don't see it leaching out, whereas with the compost, which you're still adding nitrogen with that, you just have less of the nitrogen, but that's not something I've ever really heard of or run into that is an issue, which isn't to say that it isn't. It's just one that I'm not familiar with why that would be the case specifically. Okay, so I'll repeat the question. The question was, somebody has a miniature red maple, and I am going to guess that they mean a Japanese maple, a red leaf Japanese maple, and not a miniature form of our native red maple. You can correct in the chat if that is wrong. So they have it, and it's got branches on one half of it, but not on the other half. And they're trying to figure out why and I guess what they can do about that to get it to branch out.
The first thing I went to is too much shade on the side that's not having any branches. The branches are going to want to grow. New growth is going to be towards the most light, and where there's not enough light, the branches are going to wither away. So maybe look at the shading of the plant throughout the day and see if it's one side of it is consistently shaded.
I would totally agree with what Dennis says. If it is a miniature, if it were pot grown, you could turn it. but if it's in a permanent location, it's just that light would be my guess. I mean, if you have shade from a shrub that's right next to it, that's going to cause it to stretch this way, away from the neighbor. So,
or if it's up against a
building
or something.
Yeah, you're going to have that consistently. I guess if you were a bonsai expert, you could move a branch slowly, but that would be almost more challenging long-term than I don't know.
What is the ideal time to prune raspberries?
You answered that earlier.
Yeah, you did.
Yeah, the ideal time is to prune the stems, the entire cane that flowered and fruited last year. So if you do that over the winter, that's usually the easiest time because you don't have all the leaves there. It's just easier to see everything. It's colder, so you're wearing long sleeves and long pants, and so you get less thorns in you. But that's the best time. Suggestions for ground covers to replace a grass lawn. I wish I knew whether they were replacing a nice sunny grass lawn or if they were replacing a grass lawn that won't grow because it's in the shade. We will assume it is a sunny grass lawn for the answer.
I know it's Sandy, one of our former volunteers lives in Asheville, so we're cool.
Okay. And there was a comment that Chris knows who the person is who asked the question and that they live in Western North Carolina where it's a bit cooler than here. So if that may factor in.
Well, we have a whole flowering lawn that Tim can probably talk about to replace a lawn with.
I guess in the sun, yeah.
Yeah.
In that case, I would say phlox, subulata. Creeping phlox would be an excellent one, especially in the mountains. It's from cooler climates. Back home in Western Pennsylvania, you'd see it growing on old cemetery plots. Got cut periodically, flower in the spring, and it got cut. It'd be there for decades and decades. That might be just a fun one to try.
A lot of carex.
Yeah, I mean, you could use some of the carex species like Dennis just suggested. And a part shade, ajuga, if it doesn't want to be not going to get tramped on, there are some really tight ajuga cultivars. It's not in full shade and not in full sun. That intermediate area, they've been doing very well in the flowering lawn. If you're not going to tramp on it at all, you could try ice plant, but they bruise so easily if they're walked on. That's the only thing there.
Dianthus.
Yeah, some of the
dianthus.
Again, those were on cemetery plots, but is it plumeria? Dianthus plumosa, or what's the
Dianthus plumosa?
Plumosa. That would form a tight carpet. That type. Those could be used. And there's a lot of hybrids now of those. You could make a really cool tapestry. You want good drainage for those, especially. You can get some die out if it's a wet time or in a wet spot. I don't know.
A lot of low-growing herbs, thymes, and things like that.
Yeah, you can, if it's a shadier spot, dwarf mondo grass. There are vines that can grow. You can't see it because of these tables, but right behind us, there's a trachelospermum that is that probably better in some shade, although I've seen it in parking lots instead of mulch where it just spreads and covers everything. We do grow some very small leafed trachelospermum that are great, some of them with colorful leaves. It really, when you say, what can I replace my lawn with? That's, I think most of us here would say, well, with flower beds, with planting beds, you don't need the lawn. But if you want something that mimics lawn, then you're looking at ornamental grasses. Some of the clumping ornamental grasses are great that don't grow like a typical turf lawn, or carex, like Dennis mentioned. Some things Tim said, the dianthus and the phlox. Other than the spring when they're flowering, they kind of mimic a lawn. They're evergreen and kind of fine textured. And, if you don't want your lawn to flower at all, you can always mow the flowers off, I guess. I don't know why you would.
If you don't mind a little bit of height, then I like Eragrostis spectabilis. It gets about 10 inches tall probably when it's in flower, and it's native throughout the state. Would want full sun, but it's like a miniature muley grass. But then it's done, and you can cut it off if you want, and it would reflush. Other than that, it's going to be a light brown. It has brown mixed in with it. It's not going to be a fresh green, but I just think I like that one. It's a little different.
It's got the great common name of purple love grass. All right, question: should we wait for to see new growth on lantana before it's cut back?
Yeah, I would. You'll definitely see what died over the winter, which branches died over the winter. You help identify which ones definitely can be cut all the way back.
Where's this person at? And here, actually, most winters it dies to the ground for us unless it's a super, super mild winter. Just for ease of doing it, I would just chop it back and let it flush up. Ours are starting to come up. I don't know.
I think part of the issue with the question is how I heard the question. I may have heard it differently. Was not how far back can you cut it, but should you wait, because lantana can be iffy here when you're in kind of a zone 7 garden. Not all lantanas are perfectly hardy. And some of those lantanas, like some of the woodier, shrubbier sages and other mints, that the top dies, if you cut them too early, you can lose them either because of cold or because of wet. They have a tendency to rot a little bit more. And so I say yes. I tell people with plants like that, including lantana, don't prune them until you see growth coming. Once you see some little green popping up at the bottom, go ahead and just snip off the whole top and throw it away like a tumbleweed. But I I tell people not to prune it in the fall when it first dies. So I don't know which way the question was coming to us from, but either way, should have the answer there.
So the question was, there's a flowering quince, I'm guessing not a fruiting quince Cydonia, that is 8 years old, but only a foot tall, and does not produce very many flowers. There are certain species, Japonica is a short one. It tends to be short and wide, but not 1 foot tall, short. Poor fertilizer, compost, and, it needs more nutrition or
Sounds unhappy.
Yeah, it sounds like an unhappy plant.
Yeah, so is it 1 foot tall and 1 foot wide, or 1 foot tall and 6 foot wide? Because there are some that stay very small but will get wide. If that's the case, growth-wise, it's probably fine. It's what it sounds to me like with the no flowers and not getting tall and maybe not doing well is it might be not enough sun. They do like sun. So that could be it. Sometimes you plant something and other things grow up around it. So if it's a foot tall and 3 feet, 4 feet wide, I would say, yeah, prune it back. But if it's in a lot of shade, don't expect a lot of flowers. If it's in a lot of sun and it stayed that tall and it hasn't stayed wide, send a private note to Chris with your email address. And, we want to get some cuttings on there and see how it is. And even if it doesn't flower well, maybe it might be good for breeding to reduce the size of quinces, and we'll get the flowering back on the thing. You'll get the first plant we release if we do that. So the question was, can you eat smilax root / bulbs? And I would say, like I often tell people, when I was a kid, I watched That's Incredible, and somebody ate an entire Jeep or plane or something like that. So in terms of can you eat it, the answer is always yes. Given enough time, and you could eat a redwood. Should you is a different thing. I can't speak for all smilax. There are certainly smilax which are grown as edibles that you do eat. The underground structure, I'm not even sure what structure it is underground. If it's just a root or what. But I've had that in stir fries and things in Asia. Certainly Smilax chinensis is in traditional Chinese medicine. They use the root for things like that. So you can. I don't know if there's an issue with some of our native Smilax. I've really mostly eaten the Asian ones when I've had it. So, all right, I'll ask the question and we'll get some answers from other people. Can you recommend a good blooming lilac for the South that doesn't get too large? Did I get all that?
One I like is Betsy Ross. I'm from up north. Traditional lilac smell is important. And it smells just like your traditional lilac if you've grown up in the Northeast or the Midwest where you're accustomed to it. It's a white flowered cultivar introduced by the National Arboretum. It's been bred for disease resistance and does very well for us. Probably gets 7-8 feet tall long term. It has in the garden, we've had 2 over the years and they've never gotten that wide either. It hasn't suckered out and made an enormous colony or anything, but they are only are flowering in early spring right now, actually in the garden. Smaller, a little bit broader over the time, doesn't have this greatest smell or some of the repeat flowering ones. The one that was first out and widely available was called Penda, which is bloomerang. We have one of those. And I don't know if it's widely available anymore or not, but there's some subsequent ones that have replaced it, I think. But they take a while to get established, but they repeat actually very well for us. But it does not have that traditional lilac, Syringa vulgaris fragrance to me, but it is a good bloomer.
I have 0 lilac experience.
Okay, so 0 lilac experience. I will say this. I will use this opportunity to say that we have a plant sale coming up very, very soon for our members. The plant sale will open up April 5th at 10 o'clock in the morning. It's going to be an epic plant sale. All told, there's going to be 300 plus plants. This is some cool stuff in this plant sale. I'm excited about it. Frankly, I'm a little concerned about my budget, my spring budget with this plant sale. I've finally decided I'm going to let members purchase first before I put in my order for plants, but it's a good plant list. And we do have small plants of Betsy Ross that Tim mentioned, completely unprompted. I don't know if he even knew we were going to have it in there, which, like he said, is a great white fragrant one. There is a purple one called Constitution, which I tried to get and could not get it. I've never really seen it for sale. We do have some other lilacs in there that are supposedly good for this area. I can't remember the names of them right off the top of my head, even though I selected them. They're not supposed to get really huge either. But if you're not a member of the Arboretum, you should consider joining because there'll be things that are sold out after it opens up for members. We will not be shipping plants though. So if you're from Michigan, sorry, but you can grow plenty of lilacs there. I will also say that if you're in the South and you're from the North and you want a lilac, think about something else. That's your other thing. We got a lot of stuff down here that'll grow that you can't grow up north. So go visit the parents, go visit the old homestead in the spring, smell the lilacs, and then come down here and grow something that looks good for a longer period. Anybody else want this one?
No.
Somebody who planted a 6-foot tall dove tree, Davidia involucrata, 3 years ago, I think it said, several years ago, and it still has not flowered. How do you encourage it to flower? And the answer is you go buy the cultivar called Sonoma, which is a precocious flowering plant. It'll flower when young, often flowers just as a new graft. I've seen it in a 1-gallon pot dozens of times with 1 or 2 big flowers on there. If you're not familiar with dove tree, they have these, it's actually a near relative of dogwoods, but it has 2 big white bracts that look like, depending on your level of poetic vision, either doves hanging from a tree or handkerchiefs hanging from a tree, something like that. It is spectacular when it's in full bloom. However, it takes, if you grow a seed of Davidia out, which is a great big old seed, it takes sometimes 15 or 20 years before it flowers. It has to get to be a big plant before it flowers. Sonoma flowers when young. So the only way you're going to get it to flower reliably is to go buy a different one. If you just have the species, you got to wait. You got to be patient. Sorry.
If they
Repeat the question if you were in
let's see. So it's wondering how to keep rabbits and ants out of pots and in the garden. If you figure that out, let me know. I hate to say it. Rabbits are a problem right now in the garden. I think with more visitors, that's going to help us now. But ants, there's always going to be some ants. I hate to say it, you can use chemicals, but I won't tell you any specific ones. But I don't know.
So the ants in containers, chemicals or repotting your plants regularly. It's usually a problem when you don't repot your plants very often. They take up in there. Seems obvious. Rabbits, a good mouser of a cat. Of course, they also eat birds, so that's an issue. A good dog, I would say, except for I have 3 dogs, none of which must be good because they don't stop the rabbits in my garden. 22 works really well for rabbits.
The local fox.
Yeah, I get a beagle. I have a beagle. He kills rabbits in my yard. He's getting older. Not this year, but in previous years he has. As for the ants, yeah, I get ants in my pots all the time. The pots that I have on my deck and whatever. I mostly leave them alone until I, just repot it, like Tim said. I don't get too upset when I see an ant crawling in and out of the pot.
Yeah, it's
they don't really hurt the plant.
Yeah, the rabbits drive me crazy. The ants don't so much. Fire ants, yes. And for fire ants, chemicals are pretty much the best solution, unfortunately.
All right, what is our favorite spring weed and how do you control it? Oh my gosh. I have henbit just covering everything in my garden. I have a small garden. So I hand pull it until I get tired of doing that. If it's in my turf, I mow it. I do have a broadleaf weed control that I'll spray on the henbit in the turf. Those are the ways that I do it.
I live in an apartment, so I don't have spring weeds. Wait, except for here at the Arboretum. Henbit is a very common one, yes. And let's see, that's Lamium purpureum, and then that's in Plexicoly. And then we also have Lamium purpureum in the garden. Both of those
very similar.
Are very similar. For me, it's either Roundup or a nice crew of volunteers.
So I'm going to go to my home garden. And so my favorite spring weed is there's a viola that I collected in China, Viola chiriphyloides. And it's got this wonderful ferny dissected leaf, small white flower that doesn't sit up very high, is not very pretty, but texture-wise, it's gorgeous. And it was growing here in the greenhouse. And we noticed it seeding into other pots before we even noticed it had flowered, which meant that it has flowers, cleistogamous flowers which don't even open. They just pollinate themselves and then scatter the seed. And so I took it home and put it in a spot right by my front door where I could keep an eye on it. See that butterfly? That's why you need flowers in your garden. And I just noticed the other day that I've got a big patch of seedlings around it, like a big patch of seedlings around it. And so I pull that out, and every year when I do, I think I'm going to have to remember to remove this if I ever leave this house because I don't want it to become an actual nuisance anywhere. But, I remember back to when I collected it and how excited I was by it, and people I was with looking at it and saying, "What is that?" And I was like, "That's Viola chiriphyloides. I've seen photos of it. Love that plant." And it wound up being a weed. So that's my favorite plant. And I weed it. I'm like Dennis. I do almost all of my weeding by hand. Every once in a while, if the weeds get a little bit beyond my control, I will mix up a tank of some kind of glyphosate spray or something like that. But very little of that because spraying is boring and I don't like that part of gardening. So
that's a question for Mark.
Well, Sally? Okay, the question was, how does she tell the difference between Styrax japonica and Zenobia pulverulenta? And either you have a plant that is mislabeled, or I don't know what. They're very different looking plants. Zenobia pulverulenta is a shrub. It's got usually silvery blue leaves, although they can be more green, but it's kind of an arching shrub. And it's in that Ericaceae family, like we were talking about with the Pieris. So it has actually flowers that look just like Pieris. They're urn shaped. They're larger than Pieris, but they're urn shaped. And then it doesn't have flowers right now. It has fruit from last year. It has a dry capsule that has small seeds in it. I think Tim's going to go see if he can get a piece of it.
Mark, can you hear me?
Yeah,
Mark?
yeah, I can hear you faintly. Go ahead.
It does. This thing does have some what look like, like a nutlet that has opened, looks like petals around the edges. The reason I'm asking is it's in my friend that I lost, her collector's garden, and I think it does have Ericaceae type flowers. They come in clusters, somewhere between 3 and 8 or more to a cluster off of the stem, but the clusters are on longish little stems from one place. They're not in racemes.
Okay, is this what it looks like?
Oh gosh, I can't see that.
All right, Tim's going to try and get to you. So this is Zenobia. Zenobia fruit, if you're looking at the fruit now, you can see that the Zenobia fruit we're probably making everybody sick.
No.
Will split open.
Okay, well, I can't really tell. All I can see are little round dots. Do they look like flowers?
Yeah, a little bit. They're split into 5 segments with a little
sort of like an anise.
Yeah, like kind of a little round anise kind of thing. Whereas a styrax, the fruit it forms there's going to be one solid fruit in it. So it's kind of a little gray ball that hangs from the tree, and then when it splits open, there's one round seed that falls out. Okay,
I don't have any seeds really to go by, and the leaves are just barely starting to come out. And I was hoping at that point I could do some, like whether it's alternate or whether they're edged.
Yeah, I mean, you can, if you want to send me a picture of the foliage or fruit or the whole plant, but it sounds like what you have is Zenobia.
Okay, I just wondered because I would have guessed first that it would have been a styrax just because she has stewardias and other, flowering plants that come on different times of the year. But this one just kind of, it threw me because when I first saw it did look like Ericaceae. I mean, they're little urn-shaped flowers. And I was like, oh, okay. So I went looking for that. It just was really difficult. So I will send you a picture.
Okay.
It would probably be similar.
Thank you for trying here.
Yeah.
Like a deciduous Gaultheria chalons.
Yeah. It'd be kind of like a deciduous salal that you would be growing out there, the Gaultheria chalon, if it's the Zenobia. But yeah, send a photo. Somebody want to repeat the question and answer?
So a person locally it sounds like a tropical hibiscus grown as a standard that they've kept over winter in the garage, and they are wondering if they should cut it back now and then repot it. I mean, this would be a perfect time to do that. You could reduce the top if you want. I mean, you won't have to, but if you're going to repot it, it would be, and set it outside. I mean, it's a great time. Then it'll recover over the summer. Hibiscus, it's probably a hibiscus Rosa sinensis, which they respond very well to pruning. So, that would be my thought. So, go right ahead. Yeah. You guys?
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that. Prune it if you want to, but if the top of the head is nicely shaped and is in proportion to the, whatever you're repotting it into, whether the same pot or a different pot, then you don't have to. I think where you've got some other engagements, we love this, love answering questions. Feel free to get in touch with us with questions if you have them. We do, whether it's coming in and asking questions if you're local or emailing us. You can email any of us. Our emails are listed. We do try and answer people's questions. Also, Most places, there's a great master gardeners, and they're great at answering questions. Here locally, there's a master gardener group that will answer questions. And they often, when they get stumped, they usually go to their extension agent, who, if they get stumped, they'll often get in touch with us. So if it's a real hard question, they often get here anyway. I wish we could keep going, but we've got humongous plant sale to get ready for. We're hoping to have the list out, but not be able to order. We're hoping to have the list out this week. So we got to work on that.
So I do have one final request before we go.
Okay.
I would like for Tim to list the names again as I close up on them. We had a crop issue going on with the camera.
Okay.
Let me get up there.
So you ready? If I remember them all.
Okay.
Okay. First one, yellow fever. Elizabeth. Lois. Yellow lantern. Judy Zook.
There you go. And those are right in the center of the camera, so we should be good.
All right. Oh, I didn't know if you wanted to do for all of us, just those.
Just those.
Perfect. Okay. Well, everybody, thank you very much for joining us. This was a real pleasure, although I didn't get to see everybody. So that's a little disappointing, but I enjoyed the questions. There were some really good questions on here. I don't think any of them completely stumped us, or at least we gave answers to all of them. Might not have been correct answers, but really appreciate all of y'all joining us and hope that you are a member or will consider being a member and participate in our plant sale if you're local or want to make a road trip out here, pick up your plants. So thank you all and have a great day.